process in the Continuum of Care program. So I know we are all ripped and ready to delve deep into the environmental review process. This is our 6th session, again, as I stated, and we only have 2 more left, actually, with you all. So, again, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Louise.
Thanks, Tiffany. If we can move the slides forward. Okay. So just want to introduce who our speakers are today. We have Liz Zepeda, Danielle Schaap, and Suzanne Sotirhos, who are all from the Office of Environment and Energy at HUD. We'll also have Justin Brock, Susanna Limon, and Tiffany Moore with us from SNAPS, who are going to be answering some of the questions that you may have that are related to SNAPS. This webinar should last probably about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on how many questions we all have. We've muted your phones like usual, so please be sure to raise your hand or submit a question in the question box if you have one. And we are recording this audio, and we'll post it on the Dropbox site probably, I want to say, sometime Monday, so that people can listen to it if they want to go back. Again, just as a reminder, if you have questions, there's a question box that's on the bar on the right. You can type your questions in that way. You can also raise your hand. There's a little box with a hand. And we'll do periodic pauses to discuss any questions, and we will also unmute your phones. Okay. We've listed here the relevant reading in the interim rule. This is the environmental review is under subpart C, 578.31, but we're also going to be talking about HUD's environmental regulations, part 50, 51, 55, and 58. And I will turn it over to Liz.
Hi, thanks. Hi, everyone. We're so glad you were able to take the time to learn about the environmental review process, and especially thanks for bearing with us through the schedule change on this presentation. My name is Liz Zepeda. I'm an environmental specialist in HUD's Office of Environment and Energy. I'm also my office's point of contact for the CoC program. So I'm going to be doing most of the talking for the first hour or so. I'm also joined by 2 others to help answer your questions for my office. Danielle Schaap is the director of the Office of Environment and Energy. Is in the office with me, and Suzanne Sotirhos, our field environmental officer in Baltimore, is joining us from her office to give a field perspective. So we're going to hold all questions, I think, until the end, just to make sure that we weren't planning to already answer any of your questions before we get to them. But if you have questions, you could type them in at any time. We'll be sorting through and responding to those throughout the presentation. So we're holding this training session to familiarize all of you trainers with the environmental review process. Conducting an environmental review can be pretty confusing and overwhelming, and there are some quirks to the CoC program that specifically make environmental reviews especially complex. So this is a topic where you may get a lot of questions from recipients. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to adjust my phone so I can be closer to it and louder. So that's what all the rustling is right now. And I will try to talk louder. Sorry about that. So we want to make sure that you, as the trainers, know the basics and where to get answers as questions arise, but definitely not going to give you everything you need to know in the world of environmental reviews. So the topics of today's webinar are, I'm going to spend most of our time on our basic hour-long environmental review training with a few tweaks. Then I'll briefly discuss environmental reviews for the CoC program specifically. During that, I'll point you towards some resources, and we'll have time for questions at the end. And there's a lot of ground to cover today. Again, I just want to emphasize there's no way to cover everything there is to know about the environmental review process in an hour and a half, and this training is not going to make you an expert. So knowing the basics, it's important to know where to get help. If you have questions, our local environmental staff of field environmental officers and regional environmental officers are available to help. And you can also work with your local responsible entity staff as well. They're experts at this and they can help. Environmental issues are inherently local and project-specific, so there will inevitably be questions and problems that your local contacts will be best suited to help with. Also, some of our policies and procedures can vary by region, so sometimes I can't give you all of the specifics you might want to know in a national training. There are times when you're going to need to know your local rules and local staff, so again, not everything you need to know could be covered here. If you don't know your local field environmental officer, their contact information is going to be at the end. So first, going over the fundamentals of the environmental review. I'm sure you all have varying degrees of knowledge about the environmental review process. Maybe some of you are experts, some of you have never heard of NEPA before. I'm going to start at the beginning, so some of this may be review, or it may be completely new to you. So hopefully you can all stay with me while I attempt to balance all of our knowledge levels. So what is an environmental review? The environmental review is the process of gathering, analyzing, and documenting compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and related environmental laws and authorities. So the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, mandates completion of environmental reviews for all federally funded projects. So if it receives federal funding, it has to be in compliance with NEPA. In addition to NEPA, HUD projects require compliance with 16 other environmental laws, and all of that compliance is also documented in the environmental review record. This analysis looks both at how the project can affect the environment. For example, is it going to damage historic properties? Could it somehow infringe on the habitat of an endangered species? And how the environment nearby could affect the project site and our clients. For example, could the site have any toxic contamination on the site that could affect people's health? Or is there a floodplain that could put people in the way of a flood? So our objective is to document that HUD-assisted projects are environmentally sound. We want to make sure that our housing and the services we provide are safe and clean for our clients, as well as for the environment at large. So all projects, to one degree or another, require an environmental review record. Sometimes it's just documenting that the project doesn't trigger NEPA. Sometimes it's a months or even a years-long process. Earlier is always better. You want to integrate the environmental review into the planning process to yield the best results, and that's the best way to avoid delays in a project. But the most important thing is to conduct the environmental review before funds are committed. Committing any funds or making any choice-limiting actions before an environmental review has been completed is a violation, and that's going to get a project into trouble. So again, this is NEPA. The National Environmental Policy Act provides the framework for the environmental analysis required for projects with a federal nexus, meaning projects that receive some form of federal funding or assistance. Basically, it requires federal agencies to consider the environmental impact of proposed actions early in the planning and decision-making process. The NEPA process is designed to encourage public participation, partly by requiring that documents be available to the public. And environmental reviews are public documents, and there are various points throughout the process where notice must be provided to the public. These are HUD's environmental regulations. I'm not sure you necessarily need to read through all of them, but they are useful as a reference. Parts 50 and 58 implement NEPA. They establish our procedural requirements for HUD environmental reviews. Part 50 regulations apply to programs where HUD staff perform environmental reviews, and Part 58 regulations allow units of general local government to complete environmental reviews themselves. This authority is unique to HUD. No other agency has equivalent regulations like Part 58. Only at HUD can our recipients assume our responsibility to comply with NEPA and conduct the environmental review themselves. Parts 51 and 55 are HUD's environmental standards. 51 is our environmental requirements pertaining to potential impacts from man-made hazards. such as noise, explosives, and airport runway clear zones, and the impact that those hazards can have on HUD projects. Part 55 regulates floodplain management and wetlands protection and ensuring that HUD projects are in harmony with those resources. Sometimes, especially in the CoC program, just determining who performs the environmental review can be confusing. So I'm going to take a look at that. This slide compares parts 50 and 58. Again, part 50 is where HUD conducts the environmental review in-house, and part 58 is where a unit of general local government assumes that responsibility and conducts the environmental review itself. Part 58 applies where program legislation allows local governments, which we call responsible entities, or REs, to assume responsibility for the environmental review. Part 58 applies to most CPD programs, including CDBG and home and public housing programs. It also applies to all programs under the HEARTH Act, including the CoC program. When legislation permits, local governments must act as responsible entity and conduct the environmental review unless a specific exemption in Part 58 states otherwise. Part 50 applies when program legislation does not allow for Part 58 to apply. So this is the case for most programs in HUD's housing division, such as FHA program, as well as some odd CPD programs like NSP2 grants to nonprofits and rural housing grants. Some of you may recall that when the HEARTH Act was first passed, it did not include the authorization to use Part 58, which was an error in the legislation. As a result, HUD initially had to perform the environmental reviews for HEARTH Act programs under Part 50 until the legislation was fixed, which happened in the summer of 2012. So that was certainly a major source of confusion at that time, and it continues to be a source of confusion to a lot of people. But to be clear, it was fixed in 2012, and now all HEARTH Act programs are again Part 58. Part 50 also applies when our regulations specifically state that HUD should assume responsibility, even though the review would normally be completed by the responsible entity under Part 58. This would be the case if the RE doesn't have capacity, or if a responsible entity can't be found because the recipient is not a unit of local government and the responsible entity refuses to take on that responsibility. So this exception brings us to a big issue we're having in the CoC program. Nonprofits receive funding to conduct leasing activities, but because they're not units of general local government, they can't act as responsible entities and perform the environmental reviews themselves under Part 58. Normally, the unit of general local government would act as the responsible entity, but we're finding that with leasing activities, many of them are refusing to take on that responsibility. So if a responsible entity cannot be found, HUD must perform the review under Part 50. So what is a responsible entity, or an RE? Under Part 58, responsible entities assume responsibility for performing and signing off on environmental reviews. REs are units of general local government, such as a town, city, or county, tribe, or state. Their certifying officer is usually a mayor. They will evaluate the review. This person is responsible. I have to say the word responsible so many times, and I apologize for tripping over it. They're responsible for the scope and content of the review and makes the environmental finding. This is also the person who will take legal responsibility for the review, not HUD. What is not an RE? This slide gets into the situation where a recipient is not an RE. This is, since only units of local, tribal, or state government can be REs, nonprofits can't do it. And of course, under Part 50, there is no RE because HUD performs the environmental review itself. So translating this a little into real-world terms, I'll use DC as an example. If we're dealing with a program like CDBG, where Washington, D.C. is the recipient, then the city would be both the recipient and the responsible entity, and it'll just perform environmental reviews for its own projects. In a program like CoC, the recipient is generally going to be an organization, not a unit of government. So if a CoC nonprofit receives HUD funding for a project in Washington, D.C., the D.C. government would normally act as the responsible entity. In this situation, the recipient will usually assist the city by providing documents and analysis, but the city will perform the environmental review and take that legal responsibility. However, the city can also refuse to act as the RE where it is not the recipient of HUD funds. What we're finding is that local governments were performing environmental reviews for nonprofits in the past, but because of widespread misunderstanding of the requirements of an environmental review for CoC leasing projects. Because we recently discovered this problem, environmental reviews for leasing are now more onerous than these localities previously thought. So cities no longer have the capacity to complete these reviews, and they're refusing to do so. Now, CDBG and CoC are both Part 58 programs, but if we were working with a Part 50 program like NSP2 grants to nonprofits, or one of the rare situations where a CoC program becomes Part 50, then HUD staff would complete the environmental review. And in that case, the recipient would assist HUD, again, the same way they would a responsible entity. They would do a lot of the legwork and research and submit that to HUD, and HUD would ultimately be responsible for the environmental review. Now, regardless of whether the project is Part 50 or 58, the recipient will always be expected to assist with the environmental review, but they will just not have legal responsibility for it. So our next step is to go over at a very basic level how to complete an environmental review. So the next few slides are essentially our very basic Part 58 training with a few tweaks. So there will be a Part 58 slant, but by and large, the procedures I'm going to go over apply regardless of who is completing the environmental review, whether it's HUD or the local government. And where that isn't applicable, I'll try to point it out. So you could look at the environmental review process as consisting of 6 steps. First, you define and describe the project. Based on the activities in your projects, you then determine the level of review required under NEPA and our regulations. And once you know the level of review, you can perform the environmental analysis according to the requirements specified by that level of review. Once you're done, you finalize the review by getting HUD funds released. Then you can use the funds. There may also be some follow-up required after the environmental review is signed. All the while, you should be maintaining the environmental review record and documenting everything. You need a complete environmental review record that documents every step of the process. Notably, you want to be sure to keep all of your supporting documentation in your environmental review record. You want anyone reading the environmental review record to have a clear idea of how you had arrived at each determination. So our first step of completing an environmental review is to define the project. In environmental reviews, we define projects a little differently than you may see them defined for the program. We aggregate all activities that are functionally or geographically connected and review all of those activities as one project. So even if HUD funding is just going to one aspect of a project, the environmental review considers the full scope of the larger whole. For example, if you're constructing a house, you can't say that HUD funding was just used for the architectural plans and the paint and only do an environmental review on those 2 elements. The project descriptions say that you're building a house, and the scope of the review should reflect that full impact, regardless of how much or how little HUD funding is going into it. Environmental reviews are public records, so the project description should be written so that a layman could understand it. You want to be clear and avoid HUD buzzwords and acronyms. Sharing this information with the public is a very important part of the environmental review process. So you want your description to be very clear and as specific as possible. So in the example above, I can't just say, I'm building a house. The description needs to include its height, the size of the footprint, whether there was a house there before or if it was just vacant land. All of these details that help us understand the potential environmental impacts. One exception you want to note If the project itself is sensitive, for example, if it's a domestic violence shelter, that's the only time in the description could be written to avoid disclosing its use or exact location. If you don't want to lead people to exactly where that is or what it is, then you have our permission to be a little vague about that. So your next step in conducting the review, once you have that project description defined, is to determine the level of review. Level of review is determined by the types of activities in a project. So that project description feeds directly in. And once you know your level of review, that tells you how in-depth the review will be, whether it's going to take you a few minutes or a few months. We have 5 different levels of review for HUD projects, and this chart shows them from the highest level of effort, the environmental impact statement, down to the lowest, exempt. So if there's a bulldozer involved, it's going to be a high level of review. If it's just paperwork, it's going to be a lower level of review. The environmental assessment, or EA, is kind of the default. For a lower level of review to apply, there must be an exemption or an exclusion that excludes all activities in the project from requiring an EA. For example, our regulations have a categorical exclusion that says that constructing 4 dwelling units on a site is categorically excluded, subject to 58.5, that middle level of review. So my example about building the house would fall into that level of review. But if I was building 5 houses on a site, that would require an environmental assessment. Note that default does not mean the most common. The majority of HUD projects and nearly all CoC projects will be exempt or categorically excluded because they're going to fit into an exemption or an exclusion. So now I'm going to briefly go through the levels of review. Our lowest level of review is exempt. Activities categorized as exempt are generally not going to have any environmental impacts whatsoever. They're going to be planning and designing costs, services, that kind of thing. The next level of review is categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5, or CENST. Again, these are activities without physical impacts: operating costs, pre-development costs, maintenance, etc. Tenant-based rental assistance, where the funding is attached to the tenant, not the unit, is also CENST. Don't worry about differentiating between exempt and CENST. Functionally, there isn't a difference between these 2 categories, so we can lump them together. Once you've determined that a project is exempt or CENST, you need to know what kind of analysis is actually required. So here we have our flow chart showing what each level of review requires. I like flow charts. Exempt may sound like you're done, but even exempt and CENST projects must be in compliance and record that compliance in their environmental review record with the laws and authorities listed in 24 CFR 58.6. These are easy reviews. They just require compliance with these 3 environmental laws and authorities. This chart shows what kind of compliance is required for all levels of review. So you can see that all projects must be in compliance with 58.6. And for exempt and CENST, that's all that's required. Once the project is found in compliance with those 3 laws and authorities, then the environmental review is complete. These are the authorities listed in 58.6. Those that all projects, including exempt and CENST projects, must comply with. So everything must be in compliance with our flood insurance requirements, the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and HUD's Airport Runway Clear Zone regulations. And again, if a project is exempt or CENST, for example, if it's tenant-based rental assistance, then that's all that's required. It's a finding that the project is in compliance with these 3. Moving on to categorically excluded subject to 58.5, or CEST activities. These are very specifically and narrowly defined in our regulations at 24 CFR 50.20 and 58.35A. If you think a project may be CEST, it's really necessary to read the regulations to make sure that your project fits into these requirements. Many rehab projects are CEST, as are limited new construction projects. For our purposes here, regarding the CoC program, the most important one is likely acquisition and leasing. These activities will always be CEST unless there will be any repairs or improvements involved in the project, in which case you'd have to look more closely at the regulations concerning rehab activities to make a determination about the level of review. But frequently in the CoC program, we're just talking about leasing units without making any kind of alterations to them, and that would be treated as acquisition under our regs and categorized as CEST. These levels are cumulative, so in addition to the 3 laws and authorities listed in 58.6, CEST projects must also be in compliance with the 13 laws and authorities listed in 58.5, which you may know as the statutory checklist. So these are the laws and authorities listed in 58.5. Endangered Species Act, Farmlands Protection Policy Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, our floodplains and wetlands regulations. It's a lot. This can look daunting, and it really can be. The good news is that for a simple acquisition or leasing project, which is what we're usually dealing with for CoC, most of those will not require much analysis. And we're going to go through exactly what is required later on. If you're dealing with a more involved project, something like rehab or new construction, then the list of factors to analyze in detail is going to grow to most, if not all, of these. We don't have time to get into the details of this analysis today, but we're working on materials for our website that will get into this more specifically for the CoC program. I think this would be a good time to introduce you to our website on 1CPD. The link to the main page is at the top of this slide, and it has pages for each of these laws and authorities that includes an overview of the analysis, links to references, and in many cases, webinars. So I encourage you to go there for more information on all of these topics. And you can find links to all of those pages using this button that's at the very bottom of this slide. If you don't get the information you need there, again, contact our local staff directly, and their contact information can be found over on the right side in that box. One extra twist for categorically excluded subject to CEST projects. For CEST projects only, if after evaluating the factors in 58.5 and 58.6, you find that there were no circumstances that triggered compliance measures, you're allowed to change the level of review by converting to exempt. This allows you to greatly simplify the final steps of the review. Instead of proceeding with public notice and submitting a request for release of funds to HUD, you can simply record your determination that the project is converting to exempt in the environmental review record. The environmental review is complete at that point, and you can move along with your project. This is especially good news for leasing projects. Because the impacts will generally be so minimal, leasing projects are much more likely than most to convert to exempt. So if you're looking at a leasing project on a site with no evidence of contamination outside of any floodplains or coastal barrier resources units, then the environmental review can convert to exempt at that point, and the environmental review is complete. Our next level of review is the environmental assessment. Again, the EA is the default. If no categorical exclusion or exemption applies and the project isn't required to do an EIS, it's going to be an EA. Generally, these are going to be new construction, reconstruction, demolition, major rehab, or anything involving a change in land use. These are less likely for CoC projects, but could theoretically arise. On top of the 16 laws and authorities listed in 58.5 and 58.6, the environmental assessment requires an additional analysis into the project. This includes environmental analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, such as cumulative impact analysis and evaluation of alternatives. You also consider how the project fits in with the surrounding area and think about factors such as land development, access to community facilities and services, presence of natural features, and socioeconomic conditions, among others. I have a lot of pictures to go through. All right. EAs require one more step of analysis, which is to make a finding. There are two possible findings for an EA. You can either make a finding of no significant impact, known as a FONSI for short, or a finding of significant impact. So at the end of the review, you're going to have to make one of these findings. After all of your environmental analysis and evaluation, the certifying officer must determine whether there's a significant impact. Significant impacts can arise if the project poses threats to health or safety, has a regional rather than local impact, has long rather than short-term impacts, whether it impacts unique resources, violates environmental laws, or otherwise is just highly controversial. If there's a finding of significant impact, then an environmental impact statement, or EIS, must be performed. And at that stage, you would need to just work with your local HUD field environmental officer to proceed. Note that this decision can only be made by the party with legal responsibility for the review. So if it's a Part 58 review, the certifying officer makes this determination. In a Part 50 review, only HUD can make this determination. If the recipient is not either of these parties, then they can't make that determination on their own. If the certifying officer makes a finding of no significant impact, then the review can conclude as an EA, and your next step is to post or publish a public notice. Finally, our highest level of environmental review is the environmental impact statement. This is required for major federal actions having a significant impact on the human environment. Our regulations state in 24 CFR 58.37 that EISs are always required for projects that in any way affect 2,500 or more beds. So we're talking about very large projects. They're also required if an EA resulted in a finding of significant impact. I'm not going to spend really any time on EISs because they're a very small part of what HUD does, and it's kind of hard to imagine them coming up in the CoC program, but I'd be remiss if I trained you on an environmental review basics and did not introduce you to the idea of an EIS. HUD does do a handful each year along with our grantees. And the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which is responsible for NEPA, has guidelines on the process. So if it does come up, refer to their regulations for format and requirements. Once you've documented your compliance with all of the required environmental factors, you can proceed with the final steps of the environmental review. I'm only going to discuss the final steps for the Part 58 reviews because for a Part 50 review, all of the remaining steps would be done by HUD. Again, everything in this pinkish color could only be done by the party with legal responsibility for the review. If you're dealing with a Part 50 review, then you're working with a recipient who's submitting information to HUD, and this would be the point to turn over the reins to HUD. A recipient can do most of the analysis, for example, looking at the laws and authorities in 58.5 and 58.6, but once it comes time to make a finding and finalize the review, it's going to be the moment to turn it over to HUD. And the same is true of Part 58. If a recipient who is not acting as RE or a consultant is assisting with the review by doing some of the analysis, that would be the time to submit their analysis to the RE so that they can make the finding and finalize the review. Now we're going to go over the steps to finalizing a Part 58 review. If you're working with responsible entities, they should already know how to do this, but we do want to familiarize you a little with the process. Now again, looking at this flowchart, you'll recall that exempt and CENST reviews don't have a complex process of finalizing the review. They don't have anything in that pink color. Once the analysis is complete, it's just a matter of having the responsible entity sign off on the review, and that doesn't need to be submitted to HUD for approval. The same goes for CEST, categorically excluded subject to, reviews that converted to exempt. If there are no factors triggering any mitigation or compliance, then a CEST review does not require HUD approval. It's just like a regular exempt review. It just needs to be signed off by the responsible entity. CEST projects that do not convert to exempt, along with EAs and EIS projects, require a notice of intent and request for release of funds, which I'll go over now. After making an environmental finding, the first step in finalizing the review is to give public notice. And you can do so by posting or publishing in a manner where the public can easily find it. This could mean publishing in a local newspaper or posting in a public building such as a library or city hall. The notice should include a brief project description, any findings, and the address of the office where the public can submit comments regarding the project. There are two kinds of public notices. All CEST, EA, and EIS projects require a notice of intent to request for release of funds, or NOIRROS, it's a tongue twister. All environmental assessments also require a notice of FONSI. You have the option of combining these two notices so that you're only posting or publishing once. And you can refer to the chart on this slide for the length of the comment period. Note that the comment period begins the day after posting or publishing and not the day of. After the comment period for the notice of intent is over, then the responsible entity can submit the actual request for release of funds, or Form 701515, to HUD. Here you can see what the first page of that looks like. This form must be signed by both the responsible entity and the recipient, if those are different parties. Once HUD receives the request for release of funds and the 15-day HUD public comment period begins, the public may submit objections to the approval of the request for release of funds directly to HUD during this stage. After the public comment period, HUD decides whether or not to approve the request for release of funds. It can be rejected if HUD has knowledge that the responsible entity did not properly conduct the environmental review, if HUD finds inaccuracies in certification or request for release of funds, or if HUD receives valid public objections attesting to the inaccuracy or noncompliance of the environmental review. If all is well and there's no reason to reject the request for release of funds, then HUD approves the release of funds by filling out and returning the Authority to Use Grant Funds, or 701516 form. After that, the project may proceed and recipients can commit and expend project funds. So that's the basics of how to complete an environmental review. As I said at the start, it's a lot of information, so it's important to talk to your local responsible entity staff, field environmental officer, or refer to our website with any questions. Now that we've been through the basics, I'm going to look a little more closely at environmental procedures for rental assistance and leasing projects, since those will be the most common activities for the CoC program. Note that everything I'm going to say in the next few slides will only apply to rental assistance or leasing unless otherwise specified. So if a recipient plans to do any kind of repairs, anything like that, that would affect the environmental requirements. First, the really good news. Environmental reviews for CoC projects are easy. These are not months of correspondence and consultation and analysis. Generally, these are reviews you can do from your desk using online tools and some common sense, and you can do it really quickly. This slide, with a lot of words on it, again returns to the issue of determining whether a review should be under Part 50 or Part 58. And it's a bit of review from a slide we covered earlier. Again, projects funded by the CoC program will normally be Part 58, meaning that the responsible entity completes the review. As I stated before, however, there is one situation where review for a CoC project would be completed by HUD under Part 50, and this slide looks again at that. If the unit of general local government that would normally be the responsible entity is not the direct recipient, in this case because the recipient is a nonprofit, it may refuse to act as the RE and not to conduct the environmental review. And if an appropriate responsible entity cannot be found, HUD must take over the review itself under Part 50. And again, this should only come up for leasing projects because that's the only activity where nonprofits will be the recipient. And our first choice continues to be to find a responsible entity to conduct the review. If we hear from a nonprofit that they're having difficulty getting the local government to conduct the review, we'll try to work with the responsible entity to encourage them to assume that role or to try to find another RE. For example, if the county refuses, we'll go to the state level or vice versa. will also seek a statement from the responsible entity saying that they're refusing to conduct the review for the environmental review record. Now, to give a little history, and this is a little tricky, this was not a problem in the past because of widespread misinterpretation of the rules. Local governments were conducting reviews for nonprofits as if they were doing tenant-based rental assistance, which requires a minimal review. Now that the regulations have clarified that nonprofits can only conduct leasing, which requires a higher level of review than tenant-based rental assistance, we're now finding that local governments are no longer willing to continue conducting these reviews for nonprofits in their area. Again, I want to be very clear, leasing projects where nonprofits are the recipients should be the only projects where HUD completes Part 50 reviews for CoC projects. Part 58 is the default and should apply to all Hearth Act programs, including all projects where the recipient is a unit of government. Regardless of whether a project is Part 50 or Part 58, the timing and frequency when a review must be completed is the same, and this is more good news. When you're dealing with leasing and rental assistance, you may not need to conduct environmental reviews as often as you might think. Every project needs an environmental review in place before funds can be committed, but every single unit that's rented or leased doesn't need a brand new review. When conducting an environmental review for a leasing or rental assistance project, you want to look at the site broadly. Don't just conduct the environmental review on one unit. Look at the entire building or site. That way, if you're leasing 2 or more units in one building, they can share one review. It's always better to have one review that clears an entire building or even complex than multiple reviews that each clear only a single unit. It's not possible if we're talking about scattered sites, but it will really increase efficiency wherever possible. Also, these reviews don't necessarily need to be redone every time a lease is renewed. An environmental review for leasing or rental assistance is generally going to be good for 5 years before a new environmental review record is required. If you're looking at a new lease, but there's already a recent environmental review record on file that covers the building, for example, then there's no need for a new environmental review record. Because environmental reviews for rental assistance and leasing are so simple, the rules that apply to them don't apply to all activities generally. So I want to emphasize, once again, that you can't necessarily apply these rules to other kinds of projects. You need to use some common sense there. I might tell you something very different if we were talking about new construction or even rehab, but if you're looking at a 4-year-old environmental review for a leasing project, and there's no reason to believe conditions have changed, that's a completely valid environmental review. This slide shows side-by-side the differences between leasing, project-based rental assistance, and sponsor-based rental assistance, all 3 of which are categorized as leasing under our regulations, versus tenant-based rental assistance. When you're doing an environmental review, we distinguish between the different kinds of rental assistance based on what the assistance is attached to, whether it's the program participant or the unit. Tenant-based rental assistance follows the program participant, which we infer to mean that HUD recipients have less control over the project site. As a result, tenant-based rental assistance is a lower level of review, categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5 or CENST. As you hopefully recall, projects that are CENST must only demonstrate compliance with the 3 laws and authorities listed in 58.6. Because leasing, sponsor-based, and project-based rental assistance are attached to the sponsor or unit, that implies to us that HUD recipients have greater control over what site is selected. As a result, these activities are all categorized as leasing under our regulations, which is categorically excluded subject to 58.5, or CEST. And again, CEST reviews must show compliance with all the laws and authorities listed in 58.5 and 58.6. If they don't convert to exempt, then they'll also require providing public notice and submitting a request for release of funds to HUD. Now looking at leasing, sponsor-based rental assistance, and project-based rental assistance, those activities in the left column. As I've said, they must be in compliance with all the laws and authorities listed in 58.5 and 58.6. The good news is that of these 16 laws, only 3 really require a serious look. A lot of this is common sense. As long as there's no rehab involved, we can be confident that leasing, whether it's a unit or a building or an entire complex, isn't going to fill in a wetland, contribute to air quality problems, convert prime farmland, etc. There's really only a few factors that we do have to analyze for a leasing project. We have to look at whether the site is in a floodplain or a coastal barrier resource unit, and whether there's any contamination on the site. All three of these are factors that could make a site unsafe or unhealthy place to live. So we still need to look at these factors before we lease a unit so we don't expose our clients to dangerous conditions. None of this analysis requires a site visit. You can determine that a site is in compliance with all of these three using online tools without leaving your desk. The rest can be dismissed pretty easily. The environmental review record just has to say that they will not be an issue because of the nature of the project activities. This is even true of compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. We've made a special determination that leasing and rental assistance for CoC projects only have no potential to cause effect. So even if you're completing an environmental review record, that line for National Historic Preservation Act, you can say there's no potential to cause effect. That is specific to this program. A lot of the time, these projects are going to convert to exempt, which means that the process of finalizing the review will also be easy. But if not, the usual public notice and approval documents will be required. For those three requirements that we do need to look at, here are some resources, mapping tools that you can use to see if these three things are an issue in your project area. I'm not going to go into details, but all of these are great resources to determine compliance with the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, floodplain requirements, and our contamination requirements. And we're pretty much done. This slide just has a few reminders. If you remember nothing else, these 5 points will get you pretty far when it comes to environmental reviews for CoC projects. The responsible entity should complete the environmental review under Part 58, aggregate projects to avoid duplication, so lump everything together as much as possible. Reviews are good for 5 years. Don't do them every year. Leasing is categorically excluded, but requires only a limited scope review of just those 3 laws and authorities. And of course, that applies to project-based and sponsor-based rental assistance as well. And remember that the recipient must not enter into a lease until the environmental review is completed and approved by HUD. I also want to make one final note before we start taking questions. I want to quickly mention our HEROES, or the HUD Environmental Review Online System. This is a new system we're developing in the Office of Environment to allow our responsible entities and other parties to complete their environmental reviews online. We're going to start rolling out HEROES region by region starting this spring. HEROES will be optional initially. And really, HEROES isn't going to have a huge impact on what we've gone over today. Responsible entities and recipients will continue to develop their environmental reviews much the same way. They'll just perform them online instead of on paper, but following basically the same process. So we don't want to spend a lot of time on it today, but we want to make sure that you've heard of it, you're aware that it's coming. And if you're heavily involved in environmental issues at HUD, you'll be hearing a lot more about HEROES this year. Now we're ready to take questions. If you have any questions that we aren't able to get to today, or you have any that come up in the future, again, contact your local field environmental officer, and there's a link to our website here if you don't know who that is.
Great, thanks. So if you'd like to raise your hand, we can unmute your phone and have you ask your question. Okay, Liz. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Sorry, Liz Stewart.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, thanks. I'm just curious. I see that the operating costs are not subject to 58, and I'm just wondering in the CoC program that can include repair and replacement reserves. In that situation, would that alter whether or not a recipient has to do an ER?
Hi, this is Danielle. Shoop, I'll take this question. So operating expenses, such as paying utility bills, and here's where you might need to explain exactly what you mean to either the RE or HUD, because we might be using the terms differently. But operating expenses are exempt, and so as Liz went over, it would only require compliance with three of the different laws and authorities. And frankly, it would hardly require compliance unless you're buying equipment over $5,000. That could trigger flood insurance. Does that answer your question?
I guess so. So it'd only be how much of the equipment? Because if they have replacement reserves, like let's say they were replacing like their whole heating system in a building.
Actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but actually replacing a whole heating system, we would count that. We would not think of that as maintenance or operating expenses. We would think about that as something that's categorically excluded, subject to. But if you're replacing a toilet, for instance, or a radiator of a system, that could be included as maintenance and have a lower level review.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, is there anybody else who has questions? Somebody. Okay, Colleen. Colleen, you are unmuted.
Okay, so I just had a quick question. Since a lot of the CoC programs do leasing out in the community, where is the best place to direct them to try to be able to find an environmental review on a building that they might lease units in?
Hi. They could just work with their responsible entity. They should have that on file if one has been completed in the past. I guess they might also work with HUD, who might also have someone on file. So, just talk to the local government that is in the area and HUD and see if either of them have it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, Margaret, I'm going to try and, sorry. Hold on a sec. Look at Margaret and then Maria George. Margaret, you're unmuted.
Okay, yeah, I want to go back to the process again for those responsible entities that don't want to do this. In practical terms, would it work that the recipient goes to say the city or the county, asks them to do it, they say no, we don't want to have to spend the time or the effort or the money. Then do they go to their HUD CPD rep, or do they go to the HUD ER officer? Who is the person at HUD that they would go to next?
Hello. Would you like me to answer that?
Oh, go ahead. Thanks.
Hi, this is Suzanne Satirhos. I'm the Field Environmental Officer, and we have field environmental officers across the country as well as regional ones. So I would recommend that you come to people like us. Come to the field environmental officers at HUD and contact us if the responsible entity refuses to help with the environmental review. And I think we heard today that we would like something in writing from them.
Right.
I heard that correctly, so that we get something official and on that.
Okay, does every field office have an environmental review officer?
Not all the jurisdictions, not all the units of general local government basically have environmental officers, but if they're entitlements like CDBG receive entitlement community, then they normally or they do have environmental officers on staff, and they would be able to they would know how to do them. Whether they have the time or whatever is another story, but they do have the expertise. And if you were in one of those jurisdictions, they would know how to contact us as well.
Okay. And again, does every HUD field office have an environmental review officer?
Every field office has somebody, has an environmental officer, yes. Not always present in that office, but we would be covering that office.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. We had a question that was typed in from Marie about the definition of repair.
Hi, this is Liz. We do have a memorandum that covers the difference between repair versus maintenance, and because that line can be a little tricky. So we have clearly defined limits on what maintenance is, and then repair is kind of anything bigger than that. We're also currently working on a new guidance piece that clarifies that even further, but I think it's available on our website, this memorandum defining that difference.
Hi, this is Margaret again, and I have a question about on the statutory, the list of 16. You mentioned that you mentioned some memorandums or some notices that would spell out, I think, the applicability of the other 13. Is that listed somewhere on your website, kind of the authority for that?
You mean the authority
for each of those other statutes, yeah, or is there some kind of, template or fact sheet to help the folks that are going to be doing this?
I'm sorry, you mean specifically about leasing and rental assistance?
Yes.
We don't have anything in writing right now. We're working on kind of a sample format that would spell that out a little more clearly.
Right.
So right now, I think we're kind of letting people use their own common sense and writing out just, when it comes to endangered species, this is only leasing. It's not going to infringe on any habitats. Historic preservation, compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is the only one that's pretty tricky because it is really clearly, specifically defined what does qualify as having no potential to cause effect. But we do have unofficial findings from headquarters that for CoC projects, for CoC leasing and rental assistance projects, our recipient or REs can say that there's no potential to cause effect. So they do have our blessing to write that up. But in terms of something in writing, it's coming.
Okay, all right.
Yes, I think, can you hear me? I think we had some language that was sort of simple, like something like this project consists of leasing and is in compliance with this section of those other sections that you're talking about without further evaluation, something simple like that, except for, like Liz said, the 106, which is a little more specific. And that was where we would say no potential to cause effects, again, because it's leasing only.
All right, thanks.
Okay, we got a question in writing that I'll direct to Danielle. When dealing with a balance of state CoC, the recipient is often far away from the closest entitlement community. Would you then defer to the state as the responsible entity?
Danielle, not necessarily. So the best entity to do a Part 58 review is the entity where the project is located. And it doesn't need to be an entitlement community. That said, if it's a non-entitlement community, it might not have the capacity or feel comfortable doing the environmental review, in which case we would ask you to contact your HUD field environmental officer. And yes, we could go up to the state. We could also go up to the county, and together we could work to try to find the most appropriate responsible entity.
Danielle, we had another one that I think I can take. Recipients of CoC leasing money are very nervous of what they view as new requirements. Were these the same requirements for leasing under SHP? I'm not entirely confident because I did just kind of dive into this once we got the new requirements. But I think this would probably deal with the widespread confusion we had under the old programs. It used to be that a lot of leasing was treated as if it was tenant-based rental assistance, and that issue has caused a lot of recent tumults in our environmental reviews for leasing. So it kind of depends, I think, on where you are, whether these would be viewed as new requirements or the same requirements that have always applied. They shouldn't be new. I think that's a big takeaway. This should not be any different than how you were doing it before, but a lot of people were doing it incorrectly in the past. So,
Liz, I just wanted to follow up on that. That is true. This requirement has always been in place. The old SHP regulation and the McKinney-Vento statute actually does go into greater detail and define what leasing is, and it's always been with leasing, SHP leasing. It was between the grantee and the landlord or the landowner. And as you all know, that in Shelter Plus Care, the recipient could never ever be a nonprofit, and that was the reason why Shelter Plus Care was only allowed where the recipient happened to be a unit of government. So that's the difference between the two, and that's the reason why that in Shelter Plus Care they were allowed to do rental assistance in that program. Rental assistance was never an eligible activity under SHP. So that, again, as Liz stated, that's where a lot of the confusion has come, where a lot of our nonprofit organizations were actually operating leasing projects like rental assistance. But the requirement has always been there.
Okay, we have another question, or a question from Emily. I'm going to unmute you. Emily, are you
Hi,
there?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I actually have just a few. I'm trying to think this through from the folks on the local levels who do scattered site leasing in particular. You know, so if I were working with a community and that was one of their projects, I might say, well, you know, go to the responsible entity in this town or HUD and see which units have already had an environmental review so that you don't have to repeat the work. And then the issue often is timing. So it takes time to do an environmental review. If it's a brand new unit that has never had one done, I know it's very quick, but it also, you know, to get, you know, you'd have to call the responsible entity to get involved. Sometimes it takes a while for them to get back to you. Maybe then they say they don't want to do it. Then you have to ask them to get something in writing. That takes longer. And then you have, you know, you have this homeless person sitting there. So one strategy would be to look at the units that have already had an environmental review that's still valid. But would that be considered, you know, would HUD have a hard time with that because you were steering people towards certain units, or that was part of your inventory? I think the leasing folks are mostly worried, I think, about how long the process would take for a unit that you know doesn't have an environmental review, not because the actual environmental review takes a while, but the whole making sure the responsible entity will do it, you know, and when they don't, all that kind of stuff takes a while. So I guess the bottom question is, would you be okay if a leasing project, you know, started off by saying, I'm going to go get a list of all the units that still have an environmental review valid and look at those first, because folks will be able to get into them right away?
I think from an environmental perspective, that sounds like a great way to go and save a lot of time. I guess I'll throw that over to the program to see if that would be okay on there.
Yeah, maybe it's a Tiffany question.
I won't answer it now. Let me follow up with you and see. You're going to get me on the spot with that one. We recognize that sometimes it can be time intensive, and we know that making sure that we get program participants housed quickly is possible. That's an issue as well. And let me follow up with management. I know this is something that's come up previously, but I don't want to answer prematurely. So let me follow up with them, and we'll probably get you a written response on that.
Okay, thanks. And on the same vein, was the request for something in writing from the RE if they refuse to do it, is that regulatory, or is that something you encourage? Because there have been some that are just so uncooperative they don't even return phone calls, kind of thing. So is that a regulatory requirement?
I'll throw that over to Danielle.
Hi, this is Danielle. Yes and no. So HUD will need something in writing, but if we can't get it from the RE, HUD can provide something in writing. So if you're not getting a response, please contact your field environmental officer. We don't want to delay projects because of a non-responsive RE and waiting for a non-responsive RE to respond to something in writing.
Great. And then I just have one last one that I'll let other folks ask. I'm sorry, I've been storing them up. Where you had the slide that said leasing includes project-based rental assistance and sponsor-based rental assistance, and that was one of the first times I actually have clearly seen that spelled out, because I think in the CoC program it just lists leasing, and so people always say, I don't know where the project-based and sponsor-based lies. Is there a specific citation that says that we could refer people to that sort of how it defines leasing or how it defines operating costs, for example, because that's, I think, also a place where it's going to depend on exactly what you're doing with the operating costs. Do you have like a definitions section or?
Danielle?
I just had one thing to say on that. Under the categorical exclusions not subject to, it does have list out what operating costs are in the Part 58 regulations.
Okay, so in Part 58 it will list out that leasing includes sponsor-based and project-based?
Will not define that part, but the part about operating costs,
okay,
it does. And it also addresses, it shows a list of supporting services.
Okay.
But I'll defer back to Danielle on the other part. Yeah.
Sorry, we had a little technical issue over here. In terms of the leasing and rental assistance, from an environmental standpoint, we kind of define leasing as who the assistance is attached to, whether it's attached to the recipient or I'm sorry, whether it's attached to the unit or like the program participant. So we don't have anything, it's kind of a program definition. The way the CoC program defines these different forms of rental assistance determines how our regulations categorize them. So it always ends up being this kind of ugly matchup between the way we define various things.
So I guess the question goes to the program folks, Tiffany and Susanna, is there anything there exists, or maybe we could produce something that clearly states for the CoC program leasing is defined, and environmental review leasing includes sponsor-based and project-based, because I think those are definitely kind of gray areas. And this is very clearly stated here.
Tiffany, I know we were working on a guidance chart
Yes.
that gave the level of review. Did we ever put that out?
I don't think we've put it out yet, and I think it's still undergoing review or maybe editing, but that's something that we can definitely get out, that we can fast track and get that out as soon as possible, though.
Or like make it maybe an FAQ on the AAQ. That's a lot of initials, but
yeah, we actually have developed our SME, Justin Brock here in the SNAP's office, has been working with the Office of Environment and Energy on some environmental review FAQs that we're going to be posting within the next month, and this is definitely something that we'll add to the list. So
great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we have another question from Crystal. Crystal, you're unmuted.
Okay, great. I think this has been at least partially answered by your answers to Emily and the discussion around that, but I had wondered if you would mind repeating the rationale for why leasing, including PBRA and so forth, is treated differently from TBRA in the level of environmental review.
It's an issue of, oh, sorry, well, echoey over there. Crystal, are you, maybe you unmute? Or am I repeating for other people?
Can I?
Yeah, I'm gonna mute Crystal real quick while you answer.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
Okay, let's try that.
Thanks. That was really strange. So our rationale, it's an issue of the degree of control that our recipients have over the choice of the unit, basically. So if the funding is just, or the funding is just attached to the program participants and they can choose whatever unit they want, then the recipient doesn't have a lot of control over the site. And so from an environmental perspective, we don't have that control, so there isn't as much need for us to review and make sure that we're choosing a good site because we aren't choosing it. Whereas in sponsor-based, project-based rental assistance and leasing, because the recipient has control over what unit to choose, then they have to do a little more analysis into how they're choosing that unit and whether it's a responsible choice, if that makes sense.
Crystal, could you raise your hand if you have any follow-up questions? I'll unmute your phone again. Okay, I'm going to assume that that was all right. Does anybody else have any questions?
I just have one comment, and then those reviews are good for about 5 years as well.
Liz, this is Susanna. Can you tell us again that memorandum that you said where the repair and the maintenance is described? Where can we find that? I looked at the website, the environmental review website, and I couldn't find it on there.
It's we'll follow up and try to send that out. It's on our. It should be on our 1CPD in our resources page, okay. But we're transitioning to 1CPD, so kind of don't know really well how to find things there yet, but it should be on there.
All right, thanks.
Okay, and I see another question from Margaret. Margaret, you're unmuted.
Yeah, and I hate to kind of belabor this point, but so check if my rationale is correct. So someone who's getting rental assistance through TBRA could choose a unit that's in a hazardous dump site?
Sorry, is that?
Because that's not one of the three? Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, if they're choosing it, then contamination isn't part of that analysis.
Okay.
Extraordinary circumstances consideration. So, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else, anybody? Okay, well then, I guess that's it. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and thank you to Liz and Danielle and Suzanne for presenting and answering questions. Tiffany, do you have anything you'd like to say?
No, just a quick follow-up. Are there any questions that you may have after you've had a chance to digest today's information, you've had a chance to view the 1CPD website over the environmental review requirements, and then Part 50 and Part 58? If you have any additional clarifying information or you have additional questions, make sure that you follow up. If there's something that we can answer and get back with the environmental office within the next couple of days or a couple of weeks, follow up with Susanna and myself, and we can forward those questions on to them, and then we can expedite a response to you instead of going through the AAQ. So that was it. Again, thank you all for your participation. I know we had some really great questions, and I'm glad we all got a chance to ask them here.
Thanks, everybody. Great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.